Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to video number 3 in my Axis and Allies 1914 series. This video is Russia's strategic video. Russia is second to go in turn sequence order. So as in the previous video, we'll go through everything from purchases to placement. But first we need to address a few points. Just to lay some of the groundwork here, although the Austrians were first to go, it's highly unlikely that any of the core Russian territories have been attacked. In fact, only two could theoretically be attacked, that's Poland and Ukraine, and since Galicia only starts with 6 infantry and 2 artillery, and Ukraine and Poland each have a like number on defense, it's highly unlikely an Austrian player would do this, and if they did, it would not be to their benefit. The odds favor the defender, and the Russians have a nice defense in depth. So it's a safe assumption to make to say that the Russians will look like this on their first turn, which is to say that their initial setup is most likely intact. The next point I need to address is to highlight that this is going to be an incomplete picture of the Russian strategic situation. To get the complete picture, you'll need to watch video number 5 in my series titled The Russian Revolution Rule. The reason I really can't go over it in this video is because it involves Austria, Russia, and Germany equally. So I felt the best thing to do was have it be its own video. Despite it being the only optional rule in this game, it's extraordinarily complex and there's quite a bit of depth to this rule. So again, to get the complete understanding of Russia and how to play this power effectively, please check out video number 5. Okay, so with that all out of the way, let's get to round 1 purchases for Russia. My preferred purchase is 6 infantry, 1 fighter, and save 1. I'll pause here and say that there might be an argument for really any combination of artillery, infantry, perhaps even aircraft. And again, I think this comment will make more sense after we go through the Russian Revolution video. One thing I strongly advise against, however, is the purchase of any naval units. We'll get into the details of why I like this particular purchase in the place units phase. So when it comes to the movement phase, first I'm going to review the Russian naval moves. Then I'll review what I consider to be a safe and sure option for the Russian land armies. And finally, I'll review a riskier and more aggressive option. We'll start with what to do with these 2 cruisers down here in Sea Zone 21. Now I feel very strongly that the best possible move for these 2 boats on the first turn is to move into Sea Zone 20. And I feel that's the best thing to do regardless of whatever else is going on the board. If the Austrians stayed in Sea Zone 18, if they moved into Sea Zone 17 and fought the Italians until one or both sides were destroyed, or like now, if the Austrians moved into Sea Zone 17 and camped the Sea Zone, in all 3 of these cases, I still think the Russians should move into Sea Zone 20. The main reason to do this is, although the Central Powers Navy is much smaller than the Entente Navy, the at-start position and the peculiar rules of Axis and Allies 1914 regarding naval units do present several options that have the potential to be quite devastating to the Entente. And the best way to blunt these potentially critical opening moves by the Central Powers Navies is to attack with these 2 cruisers if you can on the first turn. And the reason I say if you can is because, of course, at the end of your movement phase, after all the units have moved, you need to roll for mines before you go into combat. And in this case, there's a 2.7% chance that the Ottoman player rolls snake eyes and both boats are eliminated, and there's a 30.5% chance that one boat is eliminated. And in the case where both Russian cruisers survive, my recommendation is to attack. There's a 42% chance of either side winning that fight with one boat remaining, and there's a 16% chance that all units are destroyed. And the bottom line up front is that these 2 Russian cruisers are expendable. The primary concern is removing one or both of these Ottoman cruisers. And again, the reason we want to do that is to mitigate any effect that the Central Powers Navy can have at the beginning of the game. And especially in the case where there's an Austrian Navy in Sea Zone 17, you really don't want any more cruisers linking up with that Central Powers Navy than are able. In the case where only one Russian cruiser survives, the math changes on this dramatically. There's now only a 5% chance that the Russian cruiser beats those 2 Ottoman cruisers. There's a 5% chance both sides destroy each other, and then of course there's a 90% chance that the Ottomans win. Another way of looking at it is that you could throw a dice and 50% of the time you'll get a hit and 50% of the time you won't. There's a 75% chance the Ottomans destroy that Russian cruiser on the shots back, no matter what happens. And if this situation presents itself for me as the Russian player, I prefer to stand down from fighting. I'll just create a hostile sea zone and put it to the Central Powers player on what to do on his turn. One of the potential benefits of having the Russian cruiser stand down in this case is that if he is still there on his next turn, he can move into Sea Zone 17, where he will more than likely link up with other Entente ships, or in the worst case scenario, create a hostile sea zone for the Central Powers player. We'll now move to Sea Zone 12 and discuss the Russian battleship. I feel as strongly as I did with those Russian cruisers as I do with this move, and that is that the Russian battleship should move into Sea Zone 11. This move would also require that a mine dice roll be made for the Russian battleship at the end of the movement phase. So there is a 1 in 6 chance that the Russian battleship will be damaged, and that's fine. And the purpose of this move is very simple. We want to be able to project our combat power into Sea Zone 9. And you might be wondering, why on earth would we care to do this as the Russian player? It's just one boat. It also seems that we've exposed an Entente ship to destruction for no particular reason. And I don't mean to get too far ahead of myself here, but it is highly likely that there will be a very strong German attack against the British Navy in Sea Zone 9. And if the Germans win that fight, there are likely to be only a couple boats left. And if we have an undamaged battleship, or even a damaged one in Sea Zone 11, we at least have the option to attack Sea Zone 9 as the Russian player on the second turn. If for some reason this should tempt the German player to turn into Sea Zone 11 and destroy the Russian battleship, I would say that is the absolute best use of a battleship in Axis and Allies 1914. To have that happen, to have the Germans pull back, not attack the British, and instead hit Sea Zone 11 for an easy kill, as the Russian player, I'd be very, very happy to see that happen. Let's now move to the situation on land. What appears to be a solid and competitive opening move is perhaps also the most intuitive, and that is to stack up almost everybody that can into Ukraine. Ukraine is unique to the board in that it is one of only 2 territories that borders 7 others. From this position in Ukraine, we can hit Poland, Galicia, Romania, Sevastopol, and our supply line is right next door. That's Moscow, where new units are coming out. So I'm going to go ahead and make this move. We'll move everyone from Tatarstan in there, Belarus. We'll bring in Poland. We'll leave 1 blocker behind in Poland. I'll discuss that in a moment. And we'll essentially copy that move for Sevastopol. Lastly, we'll bring in all the assets from Moscow. For the pieces that can't move to Ukraine on the first turn, we'll start with Livonia. The Livonian troops will move to Belarus. The Karelian infantry will move to Livonia, and the Finnish infantry will move to Karelia. Last, we'll move the Kazakhstan infantry to Tatarstan. Okay, this is a mess, so we're going to go ahead and chip this up. Okay, that's much more clear, and now we can discuss what's going on here with this defensive position. First, understand that there are 28 infantry and 11 artillery here. And with a unified army like this, we can project our power into all 3 of these territories. The Russians have the largest land army in this area of the board. To take Russia down, it's going to take both Germany and Austria to do it. And the Ukraine is a linchpin territory. So let's first talk about Poland. We have a blocker here in Poland, and that's obviously to deter the Germans from coming in. If the Germans do come in, they'll take Poland with 12 infantry and 6 artillery. Poland actually has the most dead zone power projected against it because Livonia and Belarus, which also contain Russian units, can combine with the units from Ukraine and hit Poland. So there's a deterrent factor for Germany to even move into Poland, hence the blocker. Depending on how the Austrians moved and the results of combat if they went into Romania, even if all the Austrian pieces hit Ukraine on the next turn and were supported by their fighter, it's still about a 4-piece swing in favor of the Russians. And by that I mean the math is fairly simple. We have 39 Russian units, so obviously we're expecting 19 or 20 hits. And the Austrians all added up is about 16 hits. That might not be enough to deter the actual attack, but again, remember that on the Russian turn, which follows immediately after, we'll have troops that we placed in Moscow and adjacent to the Ukrainian territory that can launch a rather lucrative counterattack. Remember, Germany has gone as far as Poland and no further. And finally, let's discuss Sevastopol. When it comes to this particular territory, I'm actually okay with the Central Powers moving in at some point. I would just prefer it not be the first turn, and so we leave a blocker. And this dovetails nicely into why I don't attack Mesopotamia. The Central Powers armies by themselves are weaker than the Russian army at start, but not by much, so we really do need every piece we can get in Ukraine. And the reason I'm okay with Sevastopol falling to the Central Powers is because Russia is going to fall. Whether it be by the revolution or the standard capital takeover, a competent CP player will bury Russia in the first half dozen turns. If Russia falls and Sevastopol is not under CP control, it means this territory is dead income. So even with other Entente armies in here, they wouldn't be able to profit from it. But if a Central Powers unit moves in and secures this, it can be captured later in the game by the British, who are able to produce units down in India. Otherwise, if Russia falls to the revolution, this territory becomes impassable. Unless the CP have a contested zone here, no one will be allowed in or out of this territory for the rest of the game. There might even be an argument for evacuating Sevastopol completely. The only reason I leave a blocker here on the first turn is because it does take a few turns for the British to spin up and get through Persia, and I don't want the Central Powers profiting from that 3 IPCs on the very first turn. Okay, I'm now going to reset the board and set up another type of defense. It's a little bit riskier and a little bit more aggressive. Okay, I've gone ahead and reset the board, and now we're going to conduct the movement phase for the Poland defense. And this is essentially the same concept, but we're going to push everything we can now into Poland. So Livonia, Belarus, and Ukraine are all going to move into Poland. Now Karelia moves into Livonia and Moscow moves into Belarus. Don't forget the Finnish infantry, he moves into Karelia. Okay, next we'll move Tatarstan into Moscow, Kazakhstan into Tatarstan, and finally Sevastopol will send a blocker into Ukraine and leave a blocker in Sevastopol. Otherwise, everyone else moves into Tatarstan. Okay, let's go ahead and chip this up. Okay, much better. And in this situation, the Russians have 21 infantry and 8 artillery in Poland on defense. Obviously, they're looking to convince the Germans to stay put on this first turn. If the Germans did decide to attack with everything and air support, the Germans are looking at scoring maybe 9 or 10 hits, while the Russians are looking at 14 or 15. The general concept here is to blunt the Germans for a turn so that you hold on to Poland for 1 extra turn. If the Austrians were so bold as to move into the Ukraine, obviously every piece around this territory would jump on them. That's going to be a fight that favors the Russians most of the time, but not by a wide margin. And this is where we get into the whole diciness of this maneuver. If we recall back to the rule about contested zones, let's say that the Germans move into Poland, eat the casualties that they would inevitably eat. They now create a contested zone in Poland so that on Austria's turn, Austria moves in, and though they can be counterattacked, they now cannot be hit by the forces in Poland because Poland is contested and Ukraine would be under Austrian control. You now have a rather large problem because there is a significant CP army adjacent to the capital, Moscow. So if the Russian player is not careful, this can, at the very least, lead to a very inefficient defense of the capital, and at the very worst, it can lead to a very early fall. This is why I generally stick with and recommend the Ukrainian defense, but it's still good to know that this option exists because there can be situations where there aren't very many Austrian pieces here, or more realistically, something survived in Romania to create a contested zone so that on Austria-Hungary's turn 2, these units are not available for that push into Ukraine. And maybe this army slipping through into here is not a big deal on its own. At any rate, these are the 2 best openers that I've seen. Since there is no combat phase, we'll go ahead and move to the place units. And now I'll take a very quick moment to discuss this purchase. As I stated in the top of the video, probably any purchase other than naval units will be competitive. The reason I might recommend a fighter is because Russia has so many artillery pieces. If you can gain air superiority, even in one battle, it can be quite huge. Perhaps your opponent won't send in one or both of his fighters. Perhaps you'll have uncontested airspace and deliver a solid counterattack. But if you don't have at least one fighter, you won't have the opportunity to promote all of your artillery from 3 attackers to 4 attackers. And now I'll very briefly discuss the mid and long-range goals of this power and then close this video. In 1914, Russia is a power that is not long for this world. You've got somewhere between 5 to 8 turns to do something to the Central Powers. And that something that you're looking to do is inflict casualties on the Central Powers forces in a significant way. Just to take this board state as an example, if the German player stood down and the Austrian player moved in, the Russian player would absolutely be looking to fight this kind of a fight. We're looking to fight a large set-piece battle that's in your favor at least once before having to defend Moscow. But generally speaking, by turn 4, your back will be against the wall. And even though we're far from the end of the game, it is close to the end for Russia, so we'll call this the end game goal. The end game goal is to kill as many Central Powers troops as you can, and or keep them pinned up back here for as long as you can. Those are really the 2 main goals for Russia. Kill as many CP pieces, and take as much time as you can away from them. More details on how to do that precisely will be fleshed out in the Russian Revolution video. So now we'll do a quick recap and close this video. This was Russia's strategic video. After going over the recommended purchase, we reviewed the cruiser combat down here in C-Zone 21 and 20, and the battleship movement from C-Zone 12 to C-Zone 11. I then demonstrated 2 options for the Russian land armies. One was to consolidate in Ukraine, and then I also reviewed the Polish option. This is a bit more aggressive, it can be a bit risky, and I might reserve it for the more experienced Entente player. After the place units phase, I reviewed mid and long range goals for this power. And I want to close by repeating what I said at the top of the video. This is an incomplete strategic picture for Russia. Please watch video number 5, the Russian Revolution, to get the complete picture. If you're playing this over the board or in a tournament, I recommend that this power be played by the person who understands the Russian Revolution rule the best. And that's for the simple fact that when it comes to that rule, Russia really does have the final say. But more on that later. Thanks for watching, all the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.